I have watched a great many powerful people misjudge a quiet man, but I have never seen it happen faster than the morning Cecily Whitmore met Nolan Pierce. 3 days before the vote that would decide who controlled her family's company, a clause older than she was forced her to marry, and the man her lawyer produced was a single father in a plain coat, renting a small house, holding no title and owning nothing that impressed anyone. She decided he was a humiliation she would have to carry. Then, at the board gala, Chairman Harrison Blackwell saw Nolan across the room, rose from his chair and asked her, "How on earth did you find him?" If you love stories where the man everyone dismissed makes an entire room go silent, subscribe to this channel today. I knew the shape of the trap before Cecily did, because I had seen the paper it was written on. 3 days before her 35th birthday, Miles Rowan came into her office with a folder he had clearly been dreading, and he set it down the way men set down bad news they cannot soften. Victor Whitmore, her grandfather, had left 18% of the voting stock inside an old trust, and the language of that trust had been drafted in an era when men believed daughters needed steering. If Cecily reached 35 unmarried, the voting power of those stocks stayed with the trustee until she turned 40. She read the clause twice. She did not blink. The current trustee was Vivian Carrington, and that single fact turned an inconvenience into a knife at the throat. In 4 days, the board would vote on whether Cecily kept the chief executive's chair, and 18% was precisely the margin between a comfortable majority and a polite execution. No law in the country could force a grown woman to take a husband, and I want to be clear about that, because Cecily was never a victim of anything except arithmetic. Her choice was simply this: marry, or watch Whitmore Meridian Group pass into the hands of a woman who had been circling it for years. She sat with that for perhaps 90 seconds. Then she asked Miles what her options were. Miles told her there was exactly one candidate who could clear a full background review and sign an agreement inside the window they had, and he said the name carefully, the way a man says a name he respects. Nolan Pierce, 41 years old, a single father, no company of his own, no title on any letterhead, no glossy financial profile, no board seats, nothing that a search of public records would flag as either impressive or alarming. Cecily asked what he did for a living, and Miles said, after a pause I found interesting, that he consulted occasionally. She heard that word the way wealthy people always hear it, as a polite covering over unemployment. Nolan came to the office the following afternoon. He wore a gray coat that had been good perhaps 8 years earlier, a watch that cost less than her assistant's lunch, and shoes that had been resoled at least once. He had parked an aging sport utility vehicle in the visitor's lot, and the security desk had made him sign in twice. He was not nervous, which she noticed without understanding, and he did not look around the room to price the art, which she also noticed. She read him in under a minute and reached a conclusion she would defend for weeks. Here, she thought, is a man with nothing left to lose. I have replayed that conversation many times, and the thing that unsettled Cecily most was not what Nolan said. It was what he refused. She offered a payment structure her lawyers had built to be generous enough to guarantee compliance, an amount that would have resolved a decade of ordinary worries in an afternoon. Nolan listened to the entire proposal without interrupting, then told her he did not want the money. Not less of it, not on a different schedule, not held in escrow. He simply did not want it, and he said so the way a man declines a second cup of coffee. She pushed because people like Cecily push, and she asked him what he did want. He said one thing, in a voice that had no heat in it at all. Keep my daughter out of this. He would sign whatever she needed, appear wherever she required, say whatever the arrangement demanded of him, and in exchange his 11-year-old daughter Laurel would never be photographed, quoted, mentioned, or made into anyone's asset. Cecily agreed instantly, because it cost her nothing, and she translated his calm into wounded pride. the small dignity of a poor man protecting the one thing he still owned. That mistranslation was the first seed of everything that followed. The prenuptial agreement was, in my honest estimation, one of the harshest documents I have ever seen presented to a willing signatory. Nolan surrendered every claim to Whitmore property, present and future. He surrendered any interest in stock, dividends, or trust distributions. He waived spousal support in the event of dissolution, waived any claim arising from appreciation during the marriage, and accepted a confidentiality provision with penalties that would have frightened most attorneys. Cecily's counsel had written it as a fortress, expecting negotiation, expecting a counteroffer, expecting at minimum a request for a modest floor. There was none. She added terms that had nothing to do with money, and those were the ones that told me who she was that week. Separate bedrooms, formally specified. A list of rooms in the penthouse he was not to enter, a schedule of public events he would attend, and a longer list he would not. A clause requiring him to defer any question about the company to her without exception. Nolan read all 41 pages, front to back, at a speed that should have alarmed someone in that room. Then he asked for a pen. He did not bargain. He turned to the back, wrote 3 additional lines in careful handwriting, initialed them, and signed. Cecily's lawyer glanced at the additions, saw that they only reduced Nolan's entitlements further, and waved them through as harmless. Cecily, watching him sign without protest, felt no gratitude at all, only a fresh conviction that he did not comprehend the scale of what he had just given away. I remember thinking that she had mistaken generosity for ignorance, which is the most expensive error rich people make. The civil ceremony took 11 minutes on a Thursday morning, with Miles as one witness and a clerk as the other. There were no flowers, no photographs, no rings beyond the plain band. Cecily's assistant had purchased that same morning. Nolan arrived on time, in a suit that did not fit him well, and he thanked the clerk by name. Cecily signed the register, checked her watch, and told her driver they were going to the office. In the elevator down to the garage, she reviewed her notes for a call with a lender in Chicago. Her marriage occupied roughly the same space in her mind as a parking validation. At Whitmore Meridian headquarters, she walked him past the security desk and let them issue him a visitor's badge, the temporary kind on a plastic clip, and she did not correct it. Senior leadership saw that badge before they saw his face. She introduced him to the chief financial officer as Nolan, and left the sentence there, unfinished, hanging in the air like a door she had chosen not to open. One of the operating directors, a man named Grant Halloran, who enjoyed the sound of his own charm, asked Nolan what line of work he was in. Cecily answered before Nolan could open his mouth, and her voice was perfectly pleasant. Nothing at the moment that's worth our time discussing. 2 people laughed, the small polite laugh that offices reserve for a superior's cruelty. Nolan heard it. I want to be precise here, because it matters later. He heard every syllable, he understood exactly what had been done to him, and he chose to let it pass across him like weather. He shook Grant's hand, said it was good to meet him, and asked a question about the company's regional footprint that Grant answered at length while getting one important detail wrong. Nolan did not correct him either. In the elevator afterward, Cecily looked at his reflection in the polished doors and gave him his instructions for the following evening. Tomorrow night is the board gala. I need you to wear the suit I'm sending over, stand next to me, and not try to prove you belong in that room. She said it without malice, which was somehow worse, the way you would tell a contractor which entrance to use. Nolan looked at her for several seconds. The silence stretched long enough that she almost repeated herself. Then he said, "All right." That single word convinced Cecily she had established the terms of their arrangement cleanly and permanently. She was a woman who had learned to read silence as surrender, because in her world it usually was. But I was watching his hands, which were relaxed, and his eyes, which had gone somewhere very calm and very far away, and I recognized the expression. It was the look of a man who has already priced a situation correctly and sees no reason to announce the number. If you have ever stood in a room while someone you love is dismissed by a person who has not earned the right to dismiss anyone, you already know how the next part feels. The gala filled the Corinthian ballroom of a hotel where the flowers alone cost more than most weddings, and the guest list read like a directory of everyone who mattered in 3 states. Chief executives, private bankers, family office principals, 2 former regulators now earning triple as advisors. Cecily worked the room with real skill, and she managed Nolan's placement with equal skill, always drifting him toward the edges of conversations, always turning her shoulder half an inch to close the circle before he could enter it. He accepted a glass of soda water and declined to be interesting. Vivian Carrington found them near the second bar, and she took her time. She was 58, silver and expensive, with the particular poise of a woman who has never once had to hurry. She looked at Nolan's suit, then at his shoes, then at his face, and she performed the assessment slowly enough that everyone standing nearby understood it was a performance. "Well," she said to Cecily warmly, "at least you found someone who won't compete with you for anything." A few people examined their drinks. Nolan smiled at her, an actual smile, and said nothing at all. Cecily did not defend him. That is the detail I would ask you to hold on to. She had a dozen weapons available, and Vivienne had just handed her an opening, and Cecily chose to laugh lightly and change the subject, because defending Nolan would have meant claiming him. A moment later, a banker asked, out of ordinary politeness, what Nolan made of the company's recent acquisition activity. Nolan opened his mouth to answer. Cecily cut across him with 3 flat words. "Nolan isn't in finance." The circle rearranged itself around that sentence, and the banker moved on to the weather. And it was precisely then, while Cecily was congratulating herself on managing the evening, that Harrison Blackwell came through the crowd. He was 67, chairman of Blackwell Capital, a man whose attention was rationed like a scarce mineral, and he was mid-sentence with a senator's chief of staff when he stopped. He stopped completely. His face did something that the people around him had never seen it do, which was to lose its composure. He handed his glass to the nearest person without looking at them. Then Harrison Blackwell walked straight past Cecily Whitmore as though she were a coat rack. "Nolan Pierce?" The name landed in the middle of that group like a dropped tray. Nolan turned, and for the first time all evening something warm crossed his face. He took Harrison's hand in both of his. "It's been a long time, Harrison." The ballroom did not go quiet, but the 11 people standing within earshot did, and Cecily felt the floor tilt very slightly beneath $400 worth of shoe. She could not process the first name. She had spent 4 years trying to secure 11 minutes with Harrison Blackwell through 3 intermediaries, and her unemployed husband had just greeted him the way you greet a former colleague. Harrison turned to her, still holding Nolan's forearm. "How do you two know each other?" Cecily heard her own voice answer, thin and irritated and utterly unprepared. "He's my husband." Harrison laughed because he assumed it was a joke, a good one, and he looked to Nolan for the punchline. Nolan did not give him one. Harrison looked from one to the other, watched Cecily's expression fail to change, and understood that it was true. The amusement drained out of him and something else replaced it, something closer to astonishment with an edge of professional envy. He asked his question quietly, but not so quietly that the circle missed it. "How did you find him?" Cecily frowned, genuinely lost now, and said she did not understand the question. Harrison Blackwell studied her for a long moment, and I think he was deciding how much mercy to extend. Then he asked the thing that would keep her awake for 2 nights. "Cecily, do you have any idea who you just married?" Behind her, Vivian Carrington's glass stopped halfway to her mouth, and for the first time in 9 years, that woman's face showed something she had not planned. Nolan simply looked at the floor, the way a man does when he has been recognized and would rather not have been. Cecily said nothing because there was nothing available to say. She did not sleep that night, and by 6 the next morning she had a member of the corporate security team on the phone. "Run him again," she said. "Everything. Nolan Pierce, 41, and I want depth, not a credit score." The report came back at 4 that afternoon, and it was the strangest document Cecily had ever read because of what was absent from it. No litigation, no bankruptcy, no liens, no judgments, no arrests, not even a moving violation in 11 years. No company registered in his name, in any state, ever. Cecily confronted him that evening in the penthouse kitchen while he was slicing an apple. She accused him of concealing his identity, of engineering proximity to her, of playing some long and patient game whose shape she could not yet see. She used the word manipulation twice. Nolan listened, set down the knife, and said that he had answered every question Miles Rowan had asked him truthfully, and that no one had asked him anything else. Then he offered her half the apple. His refusal to explain himself enraged her more thoroughly than any lie could have. So she called Harrison Blackwell, and to her surprise he took the call in under an hour. What he told her, carefully, with the discretion of a man honoring an old confidentiality agreement, reorganized her understanding of the last 8 years of American finance. Roughly 8 years earlier, Blackwell Capital had walked into a liquidity crisis severe enough to threaten 4 of its portfolio companies and perhaps 11,000 jobs. Every bank, every restructuring advisor, and every crisis consultant had arrived with the same expensive answer. Sell assets fast, accept the discount, survive smaller. Harrison had been 3 days from signing that surrender, and then a younger man he had met exactly once brought him a different plan. Nolan Pierce spent 6 weeks inside that company, and what he did there was not glamorous and would never make a headline. He rebuilt the timing of cash flows across 7 subsidiaries. He renegotiated the covenant tests that were about to trip, trading tighter reporting for looser thresholds. He restructured maturities so that no single quarter carried more obligation than it could bear, and he found a receivables facility that 3 larger firms had overlooked because it was tedious to document. Blackwell Capital never sold a single asset at a distressed price. The entire engagement was covered by a confidentiality agreement so complete that Harrison had never spoken Nolan's name in public, not once, in 8 years. "I offered him a position," Harrison told her on that call. "Partner track. 7 figures annually, guaranteed for 4 years, with a slice of the fund." Cecily asked, already knowing whether Nolan had refused. Harrison's answer came slowly. "Not only me. There had been an approach from a Houston energy conglomerate, another from a family holding company in Minnesota, another from a bank Cecily had spent a decade trying to impress. In the small and closed world of companies standing at the edge of a cliff, the method he had built had acquired a name that circulated only in private. They called it the Pierce Framework. Then his wife got sick and everything stopped. Harrison told Cecily that Nolan turned down an engagement worth more than most careers in order to drive to appointments and sit in waiting rooms and be home in the evenings. When she died, Nolan simply left the industry, and he did it with a thoroughness that impressed even the people who resented it. No interviews, no professional profile anywhere online, no conference panels, no advisory board seats, no new clients, no exceptions made for old friends. He sold the large house, rented the small one, and became a man who walked his daughter to the corner every morning. Harrison Blackwell had not seen him in almost 6 years, and had assumed, with real sadness, that he never would again. He had made 3 attempts to reach him and stopped when it became clear that Nolan wanted to be left alone. So the question he had asked in that ballroom had not been an insult, and it had not been rhetorical. It had been the honest bewilderment of a man watching a 35-year-old executive casually produce a person that half of Wall Street had been unable to locate for the better part of a decade. How, exactly, had Cecily Whitmore found him? She had not, of course. He had allowed himself to be found. Now I have to tell you the part that made me angriest, and I say that as someone with no stake in any of it. Cecily Whitmore did not apologize. She had the whole picture in her hands, the crisis he had solved, the money he had declined, the silence he had kept while she made a joke of him in front of her own executives, and her pride found a way to convert every bit of it into a grievance against him. If he was that valuable, she reasoned, then his ordinary coat and his old vehicle were a costume. If he was that capable, then letting her underestimate him had been a deliberate act. Somebody, she concluded, had made a fool of her, and it could not be herself. She said as much 3 nights later, standing in the doorway of the guest room with the security report in her hand. "You enjoyed it, didn't you?" she said. "Watching me turn myself into an idiot in front of Harrison Blackwell. You let it happen." Nolan was folding laundry, a stack of small shirts, and he did not stop. He said that he had worn the suit she sent, stood where she asked, and said nothing, exactly as instructed. Then he looked up. "I never asked you to look down on me." 6 words, delivered without heat, and they went through her cleanly. Cecily had built an entire architecture of justification in 72 hours, and that sentence pulled the keystone out of it, because it was simply true. He had never claimed poverty, never performed helplessness, never asked for pity or for credit. She had constructed a man out of a coat and a parking space, and then resented him for not matching the drawing. She stood in that doorway with her mouth slightly open and no answer available. Then she got colder, because that was the only direction she knew how to move. Meanwhile, the company was beginning to make a sound that experienced people recognize. The acquisition of Northvale Systems, closed 11 weeks earlier for $420 million, was not performing to model. The chief financial officer briefed the executive committee and used the phrase short-term timing variance 4 separate times. He attributed it to seasonal collection patterns and an integration lag in billing systems, and he projected normalization by the second quarter. The room accepted this, because the room wanted to. Cecily accepted it too, and took the file home in her bag along with 2 others. She left the summary spread on the dining table while she took a call in the next room, and Nolan, passing through with a bowl of pasta for his daughter, glanced at it the way other people glance at a headline. When Cecily came back, he asked her 3 questions. What were the covenant tests on the acquisition facility, and were they measured on trailing or forward earnings? At what point did Northvale recognize revenue on multi-year service contracts, at signature or at delivery? And did Northvale carry any obligation to repurchase equity from its early investors, and if so, on what trigger? Cecily heard 3 questions from a man she had recently learned to fear, and she reacted like someone whose hand had been touched. "This isn't your business," she said, and gathered the pages. Nolan did not argue and did not repeat himself. He finished carrying the bowl to the table, sat with Laurel while she explained a science project about erosion, and afterward, on his way out of the room, he picked up an envelope from the sideboard. He wrote 3 figures on the back of it in pencil, no words, no explanation, and left it beside her laptop. Then he went to bed. The next afternoon, the corporate development team, working through the acquisition documents at the request of an auditor, found something. Northvale had been recognizing revenue on multi-year contracts at signature. The acquisition facility measured its leverage covenant on trailing earnings, which meant the restatement would flow directly into a test that came due in 14 weeks. And buried in a side letter, Northvale carried a repurchase obligation to 2 early investors that triggered on a change of control. Taken together, those 3 items created an exposure of somewhere between $260 and $310 million inside the next 2 quarters. Cecily sat in her office at 9 that evening with the analysis in front of her and the envelope beside it. 3 numbers in pencil written the previous night by a man who had spent 40 seconds looking at a summary page upside down across a dining table. They were not identical to the team's figures. 2 of them were within 4%. She turned the envelope over twice, looking for something else, some annotation, some claim, some invoice. There was nothing on it but 3 numbers. I have watched a lot of people arrive at the moment when their explanation stops working, and it almost never looks dramatic. Cecily did not gasp or weep. She sat very still for perhaps 11 minutes and tried, methodically, to construct a version of events in which Nolan Pierce had gotten lucky. She could not build it. Luck does not identify a covenant measurement basis. It has not been shown. Luck does not know to ask about a repurchase trigger in a side letter nobody had read in 10 weeks. For the first time in her adult life, Cecily Whitmore had run out of ways to be right. The emergency board meeting was called for the following Tuesday, and Vivian Carrington arrived at it the way a general arrives at a battlefield she has personally surveyed. She had, remarkably, a rough estimate of the Northvale exposure that was already circulating among 3 directors before Cecily sat down. Her argument was elegant and required no cruelty at all. A chief executive who had closed a $400 million acquisition without discovering a $300 million hole had demonstrated, definitively, that she was not ready. She did not raise her voice once. She did not need to. Vivian saw him and could not resist, and I have always believed that this was the single most expensive indulgence of her career. "Perhaps your new husband has a view," she said warmly, to general amusement. "I understand he has a great deal of free time." The laugh that went around that table was small and comfortable, and made of the same material as the laugh in the hallway. Cecily's face went hot. She turned toward Nolan and opened her mouth, and what she was about to do, I am fairly certain, was ask him to step outside. She never got the chance, because Harrison Blackwell was in that room. Blackwell Capital held just over 9% of Whitmore Meridian, and Harrison had flown in personally, which several directors had noted with interest and none had correctly interpreted. He set down his pen. "If Nolan Pierce has a view," he said, "I would like to hear it." The temperature of that room changed in under 2 seconds. Vivian's smile stayed exactly where it was, which took considerable discipline, and 2 directors turned in their chairs to look at the man against the wall. Nolan did not stand up. This is the part that still moves me, honestly. He had every card in his hand, an invitation from the most respected investor in the building, and an audience that had just laughed at him, and he did not take a single step forward. Instead, he looked down the table at his wife, the woman who had put him in a visitor's badge and told a room he did nothing worth discussing, and he asked her a question. "Do you want me to speak?" He put the decision back in her hands, in public, when he did not have to. Cecily understood what she was being offered and what it would cost. If she said yes, she was declaring in front of 9 directors and a major stockholder that the man she had introduced as nothing was a resource, which meant admitting the introduction had been a lie. Vivian watched her hesitate and, for a moment, believed she had already won. Cecily looked at the envelope in her folder, the one with 3 pencil numbers on the back. Then she said, "Speak," 1 word, and she never asked him to leave a room again. He spoke for roughly 10 minutes without notes, and he began by taking Northvale apart in a way that made the chief financial officer stop writing. The revenue recognition issue was real, he said, and the covenant timing was worse than the memorandum indicated, because the trailing measurement pulled 2 restated quarters into the same test. But Northvale, he told them, was not the largest problem in the room. It was a symptom. The largest problem was that somebody had walked Whitmore Meridian into that particular acquisition at that particular valuation in the precise 11-week window when the company's credit facility was at its tightest and its ability to absorb a surprise was at its lowest. He accused no one. I want to be exact about this because it is why it worked. He laid down facts the way a man lays down cards he has already counted. The advisory group that had sourced Northvale and validated the valuation had been introduced to the company 9 months earlier. The fairness opinion had come from a boutique firm with 4 managing directors. 2 of those 4 had previously been partners at a firm that managed capital for a family office. And that family office had filed documents, publicly available and dull enough that nobody read them, listing among its principals the surname Carrington. He did not say Vivienne's name once. He simply built a road out of dates and filings and advisory mandates, and every stone in it pointed in the same direction, and then he stopped talking and let 9 intelligent people finish the sentence themselves. The silence in that room had a texture to it. Harrison Blackwell leaned back in his chair with the expression of a man watching an old friend do the thing he does. And Cecily Whitmore, who had spent 3 weeks resenting this man for existing, discovered what it feels like to sit beside someone who is defending you without ever once mentioning that he is. Vivienne Carrington adjourned that meeting inside 4 minutes, citing the need for independent verification, and she was still smiling when she left. But she was not a woman who absorbed a blow without returning one, and she moved faster than anyone expected. 9 days later, a portion of the prenuptial agreement between Cecily Whitmore and Nolan Pierce appeared in the hands of a business reporter with a national audience, along with a timeline showing that the marriage license had been filed 60 hours before the trust deadline. The story wrote itself. By the following morning, it had a name that stuck everywhere, and the phrase they used was a marriage bought for a vote. Vivienne's petition to the board arrived the same afternoon, and it was surgical. She argued that the trust's marriage condition existed to establish that the beneficiary had formed a genuine family union and that a documented transaction with separate bedrooms, restricted rooms, waived spousal rights, and a confidentiality penalty was not a marriage but an instrument. Therefore, she contended, the condition had not been satisfied in substance, the 18% remained under trustee control, and the chief executive had attempted to defraud her own grandfather's trust. The vote was now 9 days away, and Cecily was, for the first time, genuinely frightened. She was also certain she knew who had leaked it, because there was one person in her life who had no financial stake in her survival and no reason for loyalty. She found Nolan in the penthouse kitchen at 11 at night, and she said things I do not enjoy repeating. She told him she had known from the first day that letting a man like him into her life would be a mistake. She told him he had spent 8 years hiding because he could not compete, and that his great restraint was simply the vanity of a man who had failed and dressed it up as principle. She said his wife had probably been grateful for the quiet. That last one was too far, and she knew it before the sentence finished. Nolan set down the glass he was drying. He did not raise his voice, and he did not leave the room. He walked to the hall table, opened his leather folder, and took out the complete prenuptial agreement, all 41 pages, and set it in front of her at the counter. Then he turned to the last page, the one with 3 handwritten lines and his initials beside them, and he asked her whether she had ever read it. She had not. Her lawyer had told her the additions only reduced his entitlements, and she had never thought to ask what a man gains by reducing his own. She read them now. In his own handwriting, Nolan had declined all compensation contemplated by the agreement in any form, including reimbursement. He had waived any claim to Whitmore assets not merely on dissolution but in the event of Cecily's death, which no attorney would ever advise a client to do. He had agreed to bear his own legal costs, his own wardrobe costs, his own travel, and he had done it in 3 sentences that closed every door a person could later walk through. There was no mechanism anywhere in that document by which Nolan Pierce could receive $1 from this marriage. He had built himself a cage and then thrown away the key. "If I did this for money, Cecily," he said, "where is the money?" She stood in her own kitchen holding 41 pages and could not answer him. She thought about the payment she had offered, and he had refused, about the suit he had worn that did not fit because he had bought it himself rather than accept the one she sent after the first gala, about the daughter he had protected with the only condition he ever asked for. Every piece of evidence she had used to convict him was, on examination, evidence of the opposite. Nolan took the folder back, said goodnight, and went upstairs. She stayed at the counter until 3 in the morning. Miles Rowan called at 7 with the results of the document trace. The leaked pages carried a printer watermark and a redaction pattern that matched the internal format of a law office in Hartford, a firm that had never worked for Whitmore Meridian and had, over the previous 4 years, invoiced 11 separate engagements to entities in the Carrington family office network. Nolan's copy had never left his folder. Cecily had accused, in one night, the only person in the entire affair who had never taken anything from her. She sat with that, and I will say in her favor that she did not look for a way to make it smaller. There was still one question she could not answer, and it kept surfacing every time she thought she had the shape of him. Why had he agreed at all? A man who turned down Harrison Blackwell, who had walked away from an industry that wanted him, who had refused every dollar she offered, had nonetheless said yes to marrying a stranger who would humiliate him inside a week. Nolan would not explain it. So she asked Miles Rowan, and Miles, who had been waiting for the question, took a letter out of his safe. It was written by Victor Whitmore 14 months before he died, and it was addressed to Miles, not to her. It said that years earlier, during a restructuring that Cecily had always believed her grandfather had handled alone, Victor had quietly engaged a young advisor whose name never appeared on a single document. The young man had saved him roughly $90 million and had charged him a fee so modest that Victor had argued with him about it. Victor had liked him enormously and had written down the reason. The man could not be flattered, could not be rushed, and could not be bought, which made him the rarest instrument in a boardroom. That advisor was Nolan Pierce. The letter went further, and reading it in Miles's office is where Cecily finally broke a little. Victor had watched Nolan turn down a career-defining engagement to sit in hospitals with a dying wife, and he had written that he had never respected a decision more and had never made one like it himself. Then came a paragraph about his granddaughter, written by a man who loved her and saw her clearly. One day Cecily may inherit this entire empire before it has taught her the difference between value and appearance. He was not being cruel. He was being accurate, and he was worried. The last request in the letter was simple and conditional and asked for nothing that could be enforced. If Whitmore Meridian ever fell toward people who intended to break it into pieces and sell the pieces, Victor asked that Nolan help Cecily if he could, not run the company, not take a seat, just help, if he was able and if it was possible. Miles had kept that letter for 4 years and had never had a reason to use it. When the trust clause surfaced and Vivian's position became clear, he drove out to a small rented house and knocked on a door. Nolan said no. Miles told her that plainly, because he wanted her to have the truth rather than a flattering version of it. He said no twice, over 2 visits, and his reason was Laurel, who had lost one parent already and did not need her father's life turned into a spectacle. What changed his mind was not the letter and not loyalty, and not Cecily. It was 3 weeks of quietly reading public filings, the same way he had once read them for a living, and discovering the pattern of asset preparation underneath Vivian Carrington's position. Somebody was setting the company up to be dismantled. Whitmore Meridian employed just over 9,000 people across 4 divisions, and 3 of those divisions owned real estate and contracts worth more sold than held. Nolan had seen that arithmetic before, in the 8 years when companies came to him at the edge of the cliff, and he knew exactly what happens to a payroll when a holding company becomes a portfolio of exit opportunities. So he said yes, not for Cecily, who was a stranger, not for money, which he refused in writing 3 separate ways. For a promise made to an old man who had treated him decently, and because the crisis walking toward that company was precisely the kind he knew how to stop. Cecily read that letter twice in Miles's office and then sat in her car in the parking structure for a long time. She had spent weeks operating inside a single assumption so comfortable that she had never examined it, that Nolan Pierce was fortunate to have been chosen by her. And the truth, laid out in her grandfather's handwriting, was the exact inversion. Every hour of that marriage had been a favor extended to her by a man who had nothing to gain and a daughter to protect. She had received a gift and treated it as an obligation. That is a specific kind of shame, and it does not wash off quickly. The board convened on a Thursday morning in the room with the long walnut table and the portrait of Victor Whitmore on the north wall. Vivian Carrington arrived early and confident, and she had earned that confidence honestly. She held a trustee position, a documented leak, a national story about a purchased marriage, a petition supported by outside counsel, and a $300 million hole with the chief executive's fingerprints on it. She expected the marriage condition to be voided in substance, the 18% to remain in her hands, and Cecily to be replaced before lunch. She had planned everything except the seating, because Cecily Whitmore did not put her husband in a chair against the wall. She walked in beside him and placed him in the seat immediately to her right, the one traditionally held by the general counsel, and she did it in front of everyone without a word of explanation. Miles Rowan, who had been displaced, sat down one chair over and looked quietly delighted. 2 directors exchanged a glance. Vivian looked at that arrangement for a moment and then decided to treat it as a final gift. She could not help herself, and she had never learned that the last insult is the one that gets remembered. "Do you honestly believe," she said to Nolan pleasantly, "that a few spreadsheets make you a man who belongs in this room?" Before Nolan could answer, Harrison Blackwell spoke from the other side of the table without looking up from his folder. "Vivienne, you might want to ask how many people in this room have hired him." The pause that followed lasted about 4 seconds and rearranged the entire meeting. Then a director named Ruth Okonjo said evenly that Blackwell was not the only one, and that in 2019 a company where she had served as chief executive had retained an outside advisor under a confidentiality agreement she had honored ever since. A second director, older and quieter, said that he had signed a similar agreement in 2017 and had always wondered who else had. Nolan presented for 22 minutes, and he brought documents rather than accusations. First, that Northvale Systems had been deliberately overvalued, and he showed the comparable transactions that the fairness opinion had excluded and the two it had inflated. Second, that the intermediary advisory group carried financial relationships to the Carrington network, traced through partnership filings, a common administrative address in 2022, and an incentive structure that paid on closing rather than performance. Third, and this is where the room went cold, he produced the outline of a divestiture plan for 3 Whitmore assets, prepared by a broker in February, contingent on a change in executive leadership, with indicative buyers who were funds in which trustee-adjacent entities held positions. There was no arrest. Nobody shouted. Nobody was escorted anywhere, and I think it is important that you understand how ordinary the end of a powerful person's ambition actually looks. It was documents, timestamps, filing records, 3 emails Vivienne had sent from her personal account to a broker, and roughly 6 questions she was unable to answer in complete sentences. Her allies on that board did not attack her. They simply stopped meeting her eyes, one by one, in the specific order of their self-interest. By the second hour, she had asked to respond in writing, rather than aloud. Here is the part I find almost too satisfying to describe fairly. Vivian Carrington had engineered the entire situation herself. She had held the trustee position, she had let the clause run towards Cecily's birthday, and she had counted on a rushed marriage to a nobody, making her rival look desperate and weak in front of the very people whose votes she needed. She built the pressure that forced Cecily to marry in 60 hours, and in doing so, she reached into a small rented house on a quiet street and pulled Nolan Pierce back onto the board she was playing on. 6 years of anonymity ended because Vivian needed Cecily to look foolish. The petition failed 8-2. Vivian lost the trustee position within a month, following a review that examined conflicts she could not survive on paper. The 18% voted, at last, according to the intent of a man who had been dead 4 years. Cecily Whitmore kept the chief executive's chair, and the Northvale exposure was restructured over the following 2 quarters using an approach that the finance team came to describe with no idea what they were repeating as the framework. Nolan was not in the room for any of that. He had gone home to make dinner. After the vote, he asked for nothing, and I mean nothing at all. No advisory contract, no consulting fee, no seat on the board that would have offered him one gladly, no stock, no title, not so much as an expense reimbursement for 4 months of dry cleaning. Harrison Blackwell made his offer again in a hallway and was refused again in the same friendly way. 2 directors approached Nolan privately and got the same answer. He told Cecily only that the danger had passed and that the company would be steady inside a year. Then he began putting his things into the same 2 bags he had arrived with. Their agreement had always permitted dissolution once the voting rights were secured. That was Clause 14, and Cecily had insisted on it. So on a Sunday evening in the penthouse she had specified he could not fully enter, Nolan folded his shirts and told her his lease was still current and Laurel's school year had 6 weeks left. Everything was arranged. He was not angry, not wounded, not making a point. He was simply a man completing a task he had agreed to complete, and the completeness of it frightened her more than any argument would have. And this is where the whole thing turns over, cleanly on the same words it started with. On the first day, she had told him not to imagine that this marriage made him part of her world. Now she stood in a doorway with her hands empty and asked the question she had spent her entire life never needing to ask. If there were no contract, she said, would you still want to stay? Nolan set down the shirt he was holding. He did not answer her, and the silence went on long enough to hurt. Because he was not going to accept an apology built on the wrong foundation. He asked her what, exactly, she was sorry for, and Cecily, to her enormous credit, did not say what she had rehearsed. She did not say she was sorry for failing to recognize a man that Harrison Blackwell respected, or for underestimating an advisor whom 2 directors had secretly hired. Those apologies would have been about his value, and would have meant that a genuinely unremarkable man deserved the visitor's badge, and the laughter, and the sentence about nothing worth discussing. What she said instead was the thing that took her 35 years to reach. She said that even if he had been exactly what she assumed on the first day, an ordinary single father with an old vehicle and no title, and nothing anyone in her industry would ever want, she still would have had no right to treat him as a lesser person. Not because he turned out to be extraordinary, because nobody has that right, and she had used it freely for years, on him and on 100 people before him. She said she did not know yet how to be someone who had never learned that. She said she would like to try. Nolan did not end the marriage that night, and he did not romanticize it either. There was no second ceremony, no ring upgrade, no speech. What happened was smaller and much harder. 2 people who had been forced into proximity by a trust clause decided to find out, deliberately and slowly, who the other one actually was, now that nothing compelled them to stand together. He kept the rented house. She learned to drive herself places. It took a long time, and there were weeks when it did not go well, and I think that is the only version of this that was ever going to be true. 6 weeks later, on a Saturday, Cecily drove out to a quiet street with no assistant, no driver, no folder, and none of the posture she wore in boardrooms. She parked her own car behind the aging sport utility vehicle she had once used to price a man's entire worth. A bicycle lay on the lawn beside a school project about erosion. She stood on the step for a moment and then she knocked. Nolan opened the door with a dish towel over his shoulder. Cecily looked at him and asked the only question that mattered, and she asked it lightly, because she had finally learned that the important things do not need wait. "Do I need to be invited in?" Nolan smiled, the full one, the one she had spent months not earning. This time he said, "Yes." And she waited on the step, in no hurry at all, until he stepped back and held the door open for her.